Chapter 3, The Planning School, Strategy Formation as a Formal Process. The 70s saw the publication of literally thousands of articles in both academic journals and the popular business press that extolled the virtues of formal strategic planning. In one sense, this was hugely successful, for it implanted in managers' minds everywhere a kind of imperative about the process, that it was something modern and progressive for which managers could only wish they had more time. The central messages of the planning school fitted in neatly with the whole trend in management education and big business, as well as big government practice: formal procedure, formal training, formal analysts, lots of numbers. Strategy was to be guided by a cadre of highly educated planners, part of a specialized strategic planning development with direct access to the chief executive. The appearance of strategic management as an official field for courses and conferences capped all this activity. In fact, the planning school originated at the same time as the design school. Its most influential book, Corporate Strategy by H. Igor Ansoff, was like that of the Harvard Group, published in 1965. But the fortunes of this school followed a rather different course. While it grew to have an enormous impact on the practice of strategic management in the 70s, major setbacks seriously undermined it. Today, while hardly absent, it casts barely a pale shadow of its former influence. The problem was that quantitatively, this strategic planning literature grew dramatically, but qualitatively, it grew hardly at all. One basic set of ideas rooted in the basic model of the design school was repeated in this literature in endless variety. When not propagating these ideas, planning enthusiasts preached about organizations engaging in planning as some kind of imperative, or else about the pitfalls that impeded them from doing so. Above all, that senior managers were not giving strategic planning the attention it deserved. Never was the possibility entertained that these managers might have been giving it far more attention than it deserved. To many of these writers, planning became not just an approach to strategy formation, but a virtual religion to be promulgated with the fervor of missionaries. Concurrently, hardly any research was undertaken to find out how planning really worked in practice. Peter Lagrange, who attempted to survey the empirically based research on long-range formal planning processes for corporate strategy, cited less than 30 empirical studies, many of them questionnaire surveys from a distance, which set out to prove that planning pays. The few in-depth studies of strategic planning were rarely conducted by people associated with this school. This chapter begins with a discussion of the basic strategic planning model, and then outlines the key premises of the planning school. After discussing some of its more recent developments, we present our critique of it, followed by an assessment of the context and contribution of this school. The basic strategic planning model. There are hundreds of different strategic planning models. Every textbook on the subject, as well as every self-respecting consulting strategy boutique, has one, but most reduce to the same basic ideas. Take the SWOT model, divide it into neatly delineated steps, articulate each of these with lots of checklists and techniques, and give special attention to the setting of objectives on the front end and the elaboration of budgets and operating plans on the back end. Of course, there's at least one and often several diagrams to show the overall flow. For example, Figure 3.1 shows the summary diagram from George Stinner's book, Top Management Planning. Let's review the main steps one at a time. The objective stage. In place of thinking about values in design school, proponents of the planning school developed extensive procedures for explicating and, whenever possible, quantifying the goals of the organization, generally referred to in numerical form as objectives. Unfortunately, there has been considerable confusion here. In their well-known book, Strategic Management, Schindel and Hoffer made an issue of the distinction between those models that separate the goal and strategy formulation task and those that combine them. As it happens, it has almost inevitably been planning people who have tried to distinguish goals from strategies, while subscribers to the design school rarely did so. But one is not very encouraged when such a prominent planning writer as Ansoff included expansion of product lines and merger under his list of objectives, and Peter Lagrange, also equally prominent in this school, used the word objective to mean strategies. Values or goals, as anyone in the design school is happy to tell you, are very difficult to formalize. Perhaps that is why so much of so-called strategic planning has been reduced to not much more than the quantification of goals as a means of control. The external audit stage. Once the objectives have been set, the next two stages, as in the design school model, are to assess the external and internal conditions of the organization. In the spirit of the more formalized approach of planning, we shall refer to these as audits. A major element of the audit of the organization's external environment is the set forth. A major element of the audit of the organization's external environment is the set of forecasts made about future conditions. Planners have long been preoccupied with such forecasting because, short of being able to control the environment, an inability to predict means an inability to plan. Thus, predict and prepare became the motto of this school of thought. Extensive checklists were proposed to cover every conceivable external factor, and a myriad of techniques were developed, ranging from the simple, such as moving averages, to immensely complex. Particularly popular in more recent years has been scenario building, which seeks to postulate alternative states of an organization's upcoming situation. In the 1980s, attention turned to industry or competitor analysis, simulated in particular by Michael Porter's 1980 book, Competitive Strategy, which is discussed in the next chapter. The internal audit stage. Consistent with the planning approach, the study of strengths and weaknesses was also subjected to extensive decomposition. But here, perhaps because of the assessment of distinctive competencies is necessarily judgmental, the use of formalized technique generally gave way to simpler checklists and tables of various kinds. What J. Link and MR have referred to as corporate strategy by laundry list. The strategy evaluation stage. In this stage, the evaluation of strategies, the planning literature has made up for what it lost in the last one. Because the process of evaluation leads to elaboration and qualification, techniques abound, ranging from the simple early ones of return on investment calculation to a rash of later techniques such as competitive strategy evaluation, risk analysis, the value curve, and the various methods associated with calculating shareholder value. As is evident in their labels, most are oriented to financial analysis. Value creation has become a particular popular term in the planning community, concerned with such things as the market-to-book value of the firm and the cost of equity capital. The underlying assumption here appears to be that firms make money by managing money. A further assumption about the whole notion of an evaluation stage must also be borne in mind here, as in the design school, that strategies are not elevated or developed so much as delineated at a particular point in time. And not one, but several are delineated so that these can be evaluated and then selected. The strategy organization phase. The strategy operationalization phase. Here's the most of the models become very detailed. Almost as if the planning process has suddenly passed through the restricted strategy formulation neck of a wind tunnel to accelerate into the seemingly open spaces of implementation. The reality of the process may, in fact, be exactly the opposite. That formulation has to be the open-ended, divergent process in which imagination can flourish, while implementation should be more close-ended and convergent to subject the new strategies to the constraints of operationalization. But because of the planning's preference for formalization, it is a formulation that becomes more tightly constrained, while implementation provides the freedom to decompose, elaborate, and rationalize down an ever-widening hierarchy. Hence the inevitable association of planning with control. Decomposition is clearly the order of the day in this stage. As Steiner has stated, all strategies must be broken down into sub-strategies for successful implementation. The operationalization of strategies thus gives rise to a whole set of hierarchies believed to exist on different levels and with different time perspectives. Long-term, usually 5 years, comprehensive strategic plans sit on top, followed by medium-term plans, which in turn give rise to short-term operating plans for the next year. Paralleling this is a hierarchy of objectives, a hierarchy of budgets, and a hierarchy of sub-strategies. Corporate, business, and functional, in this school, usually seen as positions rather than perspectives, and a hierarchy of action programs. Finally, the whole works. Objectives, budgets, strategies, programs is brought together into a system of operating plans, sometimes referred to as the master plan. Needless to say, this could become awfully elaborate and suggested in Figure 3.2, which shows the Stanford Research's widely publicized system of plans. The label for all this effort at operationalization is planning, but as suggested above, the intention has often really been control. Each budget, sub-objective, operating plan, and action program is overlaid on some kind of distinct entity of the organization, division, department, branch, or individual to be carried out as specified. Scheduling the whole process. Not only the steps in the process, but also the timetable by which they are carried out has to be programmed. In his 1979 book, Steiner added to the front of his whole model an initial step called the plan to plan. Figure 3.3 depicts the process, according to the head of planning, used at General Electric in 1980, then the most famous of strategic planning companies. Each year, it began on January 3rd and ended on December 6th. By the middle of June, wrote Lorange and Vansel of Planning and another large diversified multinational, top management has prepared an explicit statement of corporate strategy and goals. One gets the picture of executives sitting around a table at 11 p.m. on the 14th of June working desperately to complete their strategy. Put all this together, sorting out the hierarchies. Put all this together, you end up with a comprehensive model of strategic planning. But did that model ever get beyond its own decomposition? Figure 4 shows its main component parts. The four hierarchies. The four hierarchies, one for objectives, one for budgets, one for strategies, and one for programs. A big line is drawn down the middle because that seems to be the great divide of planning. On one side are strategies and programs under the label action planning. These are concerned with making decisions before the fact in order to drive behavior. On the other side are objectives and budgets, labeled performance control, since these are designed to assess the results of behavior after the fact. In the fully developed model, objectives drive the formulation of strategies, which in turn evoke programs, the results of which influence budgets for purposes of control. Back and forth across the Great Divide. The question is whether these connections were ever really made, or else did strategic planning simply reduce to routine number crunching on the performance side and capital budgeting as ad hoc decision making on the action side? Premises of the planning school. The planning school accepted most of the premises of the design school, save 1.5, but these made a considerable difference. First, as we have seen, the model was the same, but its execution was prescribed to be highly formal, at the limit almost mechanically programmed. The simple informal model of the design school thus became an elaborated sequence of steps. Underlying the whole exercise was the machine assumption: produce each of the component parts as specified, assemble them according to the blueprint, and the end product strategy will result. In other words, analysis would provide synthesis, or as Jelinek put in her study of strategic planning at Texas Instruments, in which she drew a parallel between the programming of strategy by contemporary planners and that of factory work almost a century earlier by Frederick Taylor and his efficiency experts. Innovation can be institutional. As for the half premise, the CEO was to remain the architect of the strategy in principle, but in practice, this architect was not supposed to design the strategic plans so much as approve them. That is because along with planning came the planners, the major players in the process according to the school. Thus, one publication urged planners to involve top management at key points, only at key points, such as 4 days per year in one steel company. The emphasis on decomposition and formalization meant that the most operational activities received the attention, especially as we have seen scheduling, programming, and budgeting. Virtually nothing was said, in contrast, about the creation of strategies. As a consequence, strategic planning often reduced to a numbers game of performance control that had little to do with strategy. To summarize the premises of the planning school. Number 1, strategies result from a controlled conscious process of formal planning, decomposed into distinct steps, each delineated by checklists and supported by techniques. Number 2, responsibility for that overall process rests with the chief executive and principal. Responsibility for his execution rests with staff planners in practice. And number 3, strategies appear from this process full-blown, to be made explicit so that they can be implemented through detailed attention to objectives, budgets, programs, and operating plans of various kinds. Some recent developments. While much of this literature has revolved around the models presented above, there have been other developments in the spirit of these premises, but more focused in application. We discussed briefly here 2 in particular: scenario planning and strategic control, as well as some summary comments by one of the authors of this book about the role of planners. Other developments concerning stakeholder planning and culture planning will be discussed in the power and cultural schools, respectively. The scenario, a tool in the strategist's arsenal, to quote Porter, is predicted on the assumption that if you cannot predict the future, then by speculating upon a variety of them, you might open your mind and even perhaps hit upon the right one. There has been a good deal of interest in this since an article by Pierre Wack described a scenario building exercise at Royal Dutch Shell that anticipated the nature, if not timing, of the 1973 dramatic increase in the world petroleum prices. Wack described the complexity and subtlety of the exercise, which depended on judgment beyond simply the formal analysis. In his words, less on figures and more on insight. Planners' time is not limitless. They need enough scenarios to cover the important possible contingencies, yet few enough to be manageable, quite literally. Then the question arises of what to do with them. Bet on the most probable or the most beneficial, hedge, remain flexible, make one happen. There also arises the need to convince management to do what seems best with a given scenario, a problem to which WAC devotes considerable attention. Changing the managerial worldview proved to be much more demanding task than actually building the scenario, but it's worth the effort. When the world changes, managers need to share some common view of the new world. Otherwise, decentralized strategic decisions will result in management anarchy. Scenarios express and communicate this common view, a shared understanding of the new realities to all parts of the organization. They also open up perspective so that the whole exercise can also be seen as one of simulating creative activity, even if no one scenario applies perfectly. In these respects, scenario building might be described as planners at their best, rather than planning per se, because the intention is not to formalize strategy, making so much as improve however managers do it. The intention is not to formalize strategy making so much as to improve how managers do it. Strategic control. A subject of growing interest is that of strategic control. Most obvious here is control of strategy itself, keeping organizations on their intended strategic tracks, what Simmons referred to as cybernetic view. Indeed, we shall argue in our critique that a great deal of what has been called strategic planning really amounts to this type of strategic control. Beyond this is the view of strategic control as a means to review and accept proposed strategies. In their book, Strategies and Styles, the role of the center in managing diversified corporations, Gould and Campbell treat strategic control in this way, as one of 3 strategy-making styles available to the headquarters of a multi-business diversified company. Number 1, strategic planning. Here, headquarters is involved in many of the key strategic decisions of the individual businesses for the sake of the corporation as a whole. The style is most consistent with the planning school, whereby the center acts as an organizing office to determine through careful analysis how resources are to be coordinated and redistributed among businesses. Number 2, financial control. This style is defined by minimal involvement of the center or corporate office in strategy formation. Responsibility is devolved to the individual businesses within the corporation. The center maintains control principally through short-term budgeting. Number 3, strategic control. This is a hybrid style which involves both business unit autonomy and promotion of corporate interest. Responsibility for strategy rests with the division, but strategies must ultimately be approved by headquarters. The center uses planning reviews to test logic, to pinpoint weak arguments, and to encourage businesses to raise the quality of their strategic thinking. Once headquarters approves a plan and budget with financial targets set in a separate budgeting process, it monitors business performance against strategic milestones such as market share and growth. Gould, Campbell, and Alexander more recently developed their work on multi-business strategy through a parenting metaphor. There are different roles within the family for the parent, or headquarters, and the children, businesses. Of course, metaphors are not always neutral. This one certainly conveys some message about control of divisions by corporate headquarters. The parents need to balance advice and encouragement with control and discipline. It also needs to recognize the businesses change and mature over time, and that a relationship that may have worked well in their early years will probably need to change as they grow. Businesses like to know where they stand with their parents, including what will be regarded as good and bad behavior. The parent has an important role in creating a family environment in which family relationships between the businesses are fostered and mutual antagonism is diffused. In another article published in 1990, Gould and Quinn found evidence that, in practice, few companies identify formal and explicit strategic control measures to monitor strategic process and ensure the implementation of strategic plans. and build them into their control systems. They call for a broader conception of strategic control such that differences between actual and planned outcomes lead not just to modification in the actions of individuals, but also to questioning of the assumptions of the plan itself. Their own survey of the 200 largest companies in Great Britain revealed that only a small number of companies, 11%, would claim to employ a strategic control system of the type they described as full-fledged. But does this go far enough? There's certainly the need to assess success in the implementation of realized strategies, and then to see whether these deliberate strategies actually worked out in the world. But what about the assessment of realized strategies that were not necessarily intended, namely the emergent ones? Put differently, strategic control has to broaden its scope beyond strategic planning. Strategies need not be deliberate to be effective. As suggested in the matrix of figure 3.5, emergent strategies can be effective too, while many deliberate strategies successfully implemented had proved to be disasters. It's the performance of the organization that matters, not the performance of its planning. One recent book on strategic control consistent with this approach is Levers of Control: How Managers Use Innovative Control Systems to Drive Strategic Renewal by Robert Simmons in 1995. Defining management control systems as the formal information-based routines and procedures managers use to maintain or alter patterns in organizational activities. Simmons introduces 4 levers of control: belief systems to provide value, purpose, direction for the organization; boundary systems which establish limits to actions; diagnostic control systems, more conventional feedback systems to ensure predictable goal achievement; the tools of strategy implementation; and interactive control systems. Despite the ambiguity of the diagnostic control systems, Simons argues that managers pay little attention to them, focusing more on interactive control systems. These, in contrast, simulate research and learning, allowing new strategies to emerge as participants throughout the organization respond to perceived opportunities and threats. Senior managers tend to select one of these for special attention and use it to involve themselves regularly and personally in the decision activities of subordinates. In his study of 30 businesses in American healthcare products, Simmons identified five such systems: project management systems, profit planning systems, brand revenue budgets, intelligence systems to gather and disseminate information about the external environment, and human development systems concerning career planning or management by objectives. Such systems facilitate and shape the emergence of new strategies. These systems relate to strategy as patterns of action. At the business level, even in the absence of formal plans and goals, managers who use these systems are able to impose consistency and guide creative search processes. Tactical day-to-day actions and creative experiments can be welded into a cohesive pattern that responds to strategic uncertainties and may, over time, become realized strategy. Planning's unplanned troubles. Strategic planning ran into trouble in the early 1980s when the activity was cut back in many companies. Most dramatic was its emasculation at General Electric, the company that literally wrote the book on the subject. Business Week documented the troubles in a cover story of September 17, 1984. After more than a decade of near dictatorial dictatorial sway over the future of U.S. corporations, the reign of the strategic planner may be at an end, the magazine exclaimed. Few of the supposedly brilliant strategies concocted by planners were successfully implemented. To Business Week, the upheaval was nothing less than a bloody battle between planners and managers. The General Electric story dominated the article, as it had the lore of strategic planning almost from the very beginning. As Business Week told the story, in the early 1980s, soon after he became chairman and CEO, Jack Welch dismantled the strategic planning system. The vice president of the major appliance business group was quoted about finally gaining ownership of the business, grabbing hold of it from an isolated bureaucracy of planners. No planners were left in that division by 1984. The signs of trouble in the planning camp had hardly been absent earlier. Indeed, the most enthusiastic proponent of strategic planning, Igor Ansoff, wrote in 1977, 12 years after the publication of his key book, Corporate Strategy, that in spite of almost 20 years of existence of the strategic planning technology, a majority of firms today engage in far less threatening and perturbing extrapolative long-range planning. And the problems hardly abated after 1984. And the rise and fall of strategic planning from which this chapter draws, Mintzberg, 1994, documented the evidence that piled up against the process, including stories in the popular press and empirical findings from the research, which contains a long string of studies that set out to prove that strategic planning pays but never did. Wilson's 7 Deadly Sins of Strategic Planning, reproduced in the accompanying box. So that's 5 of them. And then there's the other 7. Summarizes some of the problems that had undermined the process. Planners' response to this evidence was ranged from pure faith, plans are sometimes useless, but the planning process is always indispensable, to various forms of elaboration, calls for more sophisticated forecasting, stakeholder analysis, each an effort to plug the holes while upping the ante. But the most popular response has been to fall back on a set of pitfalls of planning, notably the lack of managerial support for planning and the absence of an organizational climate congenial to the process. Yet sure, no technique has ever had more managerial attention than strategic planning. Moreover, might it not be equally fair to ask whether a climate hostile to planning may be ripe for certain other kinds of strategy making? And what about climates congenial to planning? Are they necessarily effective for strategy making? As we have seen above, planning can undermine commitment to strategy making, and not only of the middle managers subjected to its centralized control, but even top managers who may be largely bypassed in the process. Has anyone ever met a manager who, after filling out all the forms of the annual planning ritual, said, "Boy, that was fun, I can't wait to do it again next year"? For real, though. Plans, by their very nature, are designed to promote inflexibility. They're meant to establish clear direction, to impose stability on an organization. Even the planning process itself may favor incremental change and a short-term orientation. Recall that planning is built around the categories that already exist in the organization, such as established corporate, business, and functional strategies, as well as existing structural units around which the whole process is organized. That hardly makes it easy to change the categories, which is what true strategic change is all about. Of course, organizations manage around the categories, for example, by creating cross-unit task forces. But as the categories break down, so too does the notion of strategy formation as a formal namely planned, process. Thus, we have the conclusion of Harvard Operation Management professor Robert Hayes that line managers complain not about the misfunction of strategic planning, but about the harmful aspects of its proper functioning. The fallacies of strategic planning. An expert has been defined as someone who avoids all the many pitfalls on his or her way to the grand fallacy. Here, therefore, we consider the fallacies of strategic planning, 3 in particular, which, to our mind, blend into that one grand fallacy. We wish to make clear that our critique is not of planning, but of strategic planning, the idea that strategy can be developed in a structured, formalized process. Planning itself has other useful functions in an organization. The fallacy of predetermination. To engage in strategic planning, an organization must be able to predict the course of its environment, to control it, or simply to assume its stability. Otherwise, it makes no sense to set the inflexible course of action that constitutes a strategic plan. Igor Ansoff wrote in Corporate Strategy that we shall refer to the period for which the firm is able to construct forecasts with an accuracy of, say, plus or minus 20% as the planning horizon of the firm. A most extraordinary statement in such a famous book, for how in the world can predictability be predicted? The evidence on forecasting is, in fact, quite to the contrary. While certain repetitive patterns, like seasons, may be predictable, forecasting of discontinuities such as technological breakthroughs or price increases is, according to Spiro Makridakis, a leading expert in the field, practically impossible. See box on forecasting. Whoops. There's forecasting. Whoops. In his opinion, very little or nothing can be done other than to be prepared in a general way to react quickly once a discontinuity has occurred. Discontinuity has occurred. I don't know how to say that word. The only hope for planning, therefore, is to extrapolate the present trends and hope for the best. Unfortunately, that best seems to be rare. Long-range forecasting, 2 years or longer, is notoriously inaccurate. Strategic planning requires not only predictability following, but also stability during strategy making. The world has to hold still while the planning process unfolds. Remember those lockstep schedules that have strategies appearing on, say, the 15th of each June? One can just picture the competitors waiting for the 16th, especially if they are Japanese and don't believe in such planning. Responsive strategies do not appear on schedule immaculately conceived. They can happen at any time and at any place in an adaptive organization. If strategy means stability as a plan into the future or pattern out of the past, then strategy means interference, unexpected interference. The fallacy of detachment. As mentioned earlier, Mary Ann Jelinek developed the interesting point in her book called Institutionalizing Innovation, that strategic planning has been to the executive suite what Frederick Taylor's work study was to the factory floor. Both set out to circumvent human idiosyncrasies in order to systemize behavior. It is through administrative systems that planning and policy are made possible, because the systems capture knowledge about the task. Thus, true management by exception and true policy direction are now possible, solely because management is no longer wholly immersed in the details of the task itself. To put it differently, if the system does the thinking, then thought has to be detached from action, strategy from operations or tactics, formulation from implementation, thinkers from doers, and so strategists from the objects of their strategies. Managers must, in other words, manage by remote control. The trick, of course, is to get the relevant information up there so that those senior managers on high can be informed about the consequences of the details down below without having to enmesh themselves in them. And that's supposed to be accomplished by hard data, quantitative aggregates of the detailed facts about the organization and its contents, neatly packaged for immediate use. That way, the head, executives, and planners can formulate so that all the hands can get on with the implementation. We maintain that all of this is dangerously fallacious. That's right. Detached managers together with abstract planners do not so much make bad strategies. Mostly, they don't make strategies at all. Look inside all these organizations with people searching for a vision and a myth and strategic planning, and you will mostly find executives doing exactly what planning tells them to do. Sit there, disconnected from the details. Effective strategists, in contrast, are not people who abstract themselves from the daily detail, but who immerse themselves in it while being able to abstract the strategic messages from it. It turns out that hard data can have a decidedly soft underbelly, as specified in the accompanied box. Such data are often late, thin, and excessively aggregated. This may explain why managers who rely primarily on such formalized information, like accounting statements, market research reports in business, and opinion polls in government, often have so much trouble coming up with good strategies. Effective strategy making connects acting to thinking, which in turn connects implementation to formulation. We think in order to act, to be sure, but we also act in order to think. We try things, and the ones that work generally converge into patterns that become strategies. This is not some quirky behavior of disorganized people, but the very essence of strategic learning. Such strategy making breaks down the classic dichotomy by allowing implementation to inform formulation. As noted in the last chapter, either the formulator must implement or else the implementers must formulate. As we shall see, one fits the entrepreneur school, the other the learning school. Either way, the process of strategy making becomes more richly interactive. Hence, we would do well to drop the term strategic planning altogether and talk about strategic thinking connected to acting. I'll take a break. I'll plug my phone. Fallacy of formalization. Can the system in fact do it? Can strategic planning, in the words of Stanford Research Institute economist, recreate the process of the genius entrepreneur? Can innovation really be institutionalized? And above all, can such analysis provide the necessary synthesis? Bear in mind that strategic planning has not been presented as an aid to strategy making, as some kind of support for natural managerial processes, including intuition, but as strategy making in the place of intuition. Proponents of this school have long claimed this to be the one best way to create strategy. Yet, unlike Frederick Taylor, who coined the phrase planners never studied the very process they sought to change, the practice was simply assumed to be their practice. The CEO can seriously jeopardize or even destroy the prospects of strategic thinking by not consistently following the discipline of strategic planning, wrote LaRange in 1980, without offering any supporting evidence. Indeed, go back to all those popular strategic planning charts and look for the box that explains how strategies are actually created. You will not find it because the writers never explain this. Amidst all that hype about having to develop strategy in a planned process, no one ever explained how the thinking of those genius entrepreneurs or even ordinary competent strategists could be recreated. At best, or perhaps at worst, they inserted boxes with labels such as apprehend input and add insights. Very helpful. A phenomenon is not captured simply because it has been labeled in a box on a piece of paper. Research, as we shall see in subsequent chapters, tells us that strategy making is an immensely complex process involving the most sophisticated, subtle, and at times subconscious of human cognitive and social processes. These draw on all kinds of informational inputs, many of them non-quantifiable and accessible only to strategists with their feet on the ground. Such processes follow no predetermined schedule, nor fall on any preset tracks. Effective strategies inevitably exhibit some emergent qualities, and even when significantly deliberate, often appear to be less formally planned than informally visionary. That's deep. Above all, learning in the form of fits and starts, discoveries based on serendipitous events, and the recognition of unexpected patterns plays a key role, if not the key role, in the development of strategies that are novel. Accordingly, we know that the process requires insight, creativity, and synthesis, the very things that the formalization of planning discourages. Morange might well be asked to entertain the proposition that CEOs can seriously jeopardize the prospects of strategic thinking by following the discipline of strategic planning. The failure of strategic planning is the failure of formalization, of systems to do better at such tasks than flesh and blood human beings. It's the failure of forecasting to predict discontinuities of institutionalization, to provide innovation, of hard data to substitute for soft, of lockstep schedules to respond to the dynamic factors. The formal systems could certainly process more information, at least hard information, consolidate it, aggregate it, move it about, but they could never internalize it, comprehend it, or synthesize it. There's something strange about formalization, something that can cause the very essence of an activity to be lost simply in its specification. As human beings, we often believe that we have captured a process simply because we have broken it into component parts and specified procedures for each. Yet all too often that just breeds a certain mindlessness. For some kinds of processes involving learning, innovating, and the like, that only seems to drive them over some kind of edge. We illustrate a formalization edge in figure 3.6. There's figure 3.6. Planners and managers need to be sensitive to just where that formalization edge may appear. They may have to formalize the time and participation in a particular meeting to ensure that the appropriate people appear together. But how about specifying the agenda so that precious time will not be lost? Seems sensible enough. And the procedures to ensure order in the discussion? Well, at what point do we realize that everything went according to plan, but no strategic thinking came about? Decomposing the strategy-making process so that, for example, goals are discussed in the morning and strengths and weaknesses in the afternoon can stifle creative discussion. The object of the exercise, to repeat, is not analysis but synthesis. Efforts to force a loose process into a tight sequence can kill it. Zahn has distinguished between systems that facilitate thinking and systems that try to do it. To quote one Texas Instruments executive on the company's systems, "We made them bureaucratic. We use the system as a control tool rather than a facilitating tool. That's the difference." The accompanying box shows how capital budgeting fell into much the same trap, emerging as a technique in some ways impeded strategic thinking. Thus, the problem of strategic planning has not been any particular category it uses so much as with the process of categorizing itself. No amount of rearranging the boxes can resolve the problem of the very existence of boxes. Strategy making, like creativity, really is creativity, needs to function beyond boxes, create new perspectives, as well as new combinations. As Humpty Dumpty taught us, not everything that comes apart can be put back together. So this is the box, and I'm going to read the boxes after I finish reading the chapter. The grand fallacy of strategic planning. Thus, we arrive at the grand fallacy of strategic planning, a composite, in fact, of the three fallacies already discussed. Because analysis is not synthesis, strategic planning has never been strategy making. Analysis may precede and support synthesis, but providing certain necessary inputs. Analysis may follow and elaborate synthesis by decomposing and formalizing its consequences, but analysis cannot substitute for synthesis. No amount of elaboration will ever enable formal procedures to forecast discontinuities, to inform detached managers to create novel strategies. Thus, planning, rather than providing new strategies, could not proceed without their prior existence. We conclude that strategic planning has been misnamed. It should have been called strategic programming, and it should have been promoted as a process to formalize, where necessary, the consequences of strategies already developed by other means. Ultimately, the term strategic planning has proved to be an oxymoron. The context and contribution of the planning school. There is, however, no need to throw out this strategic planner baby with the strategic planning bathwater. Planners have important roles to play around the black box of strategy formation, if not in it. Here's the black box of strategy making. They can act as analysts by providing data inputs at the front end, particularly the one managers are prone to overlook, as shall be elaborated upon in the next chapter. They can also scrutinize the strategies that came out the back end to assess their viability. Planners can also act as catalysts, not to promote formal planning as some kind of imperative, but to encourage whatever form of strategic behavior makes sense for a particular organization at a particular time. As suggested in the accompanying box, there's the accompanying box. By a strategy consultant, organizations need tools, but sensibly applied. When necessary, but only then, planners can carry out formal planning too, but as a means to program the strategies that came out of the black box, to codify them, elaborate them, translate them into ad hoc programs and routine plans and budgets, and use them for purposes of communication and control. Of course, creative planners can sometimes be strategists too. In other words, enter the black box. But that has more to do with their personal knowledge, creativity, and skills of synthesis than with any formalized technique of planning. Some of these roles are rather formally analytical, others less so. This means that organizations might do well to distinguish two types of planners, who can be labeled left-handed and right-handed. Left-handed planners encourage creative, strategic thinking. They raise all kinds of difficult questions, and they search around for emergent strategies in streams of their organization's action. The right-handed planners are concerned with more formal kinds of strategy analysis, and particularly with strategic programming of clearly intended strategies, which, as we hope this discussion has made clear, suit only a context that is rather stable, or at least predictable, or what amounts to the same thing, controllable by the organization. But when change must be dramatic and an organization's situation becomes less stable, predictable, and or controllable, then it's better off to rely on the looser forms of strategy making first and the left-handed planner second, but not the precepts of the planning school. So that's the end of the chapter, so I'm going to go back and read these boxes. So the first things were flow charts, right? Flow charts. And then there's broadening strategic control. Was it successful or not? Okay, the first box I'm going to read is the 7 deadly sins of strategic planning. Number 1. The staff took over the process. This situation arose partly because CEOs created new staff components to deal with a new function, partly because the staff moved in to fill a vacuum created by middle management's indifference to a new responsibility, and partly because of arrogance and empire building. As a result, planning staffs all too often cut executives out of the strategy development process, turning them into little more than rubber stamps. Number 2, the second deadly sin. The process dominated the staff. The process's methodologies became increasingly elaborate. Staff placed too much emphasis on analysis, too little on true strategic insights. Strategic thinking became equated with strategic planning. Jack Welch, the chairman of CEO of GE, described the outcome graphically. The books got thicker, the printing got more sophisticated, the covers got harder, and the drawings got better. The third deadly sin. Planning systems were virtually designed to produce no results. The main design failure lay in denying or diminishing the planning role of the very executives whose mandate was to execute the strategy. The attitude of many was typified by the angry retort of one executive. The matrix picked the strategy, let the matrix implement it. The other design fault was the failure to integrate the strategic planning system with the operations system, resulting in a strategy that did not drive action. Number 4, the fourth deadly sin of strategic planning. Planning focused on the more exciting game of mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures at the expense of core business development. This problem stemmed in part from the temper of the times, but it also resulted from the inappropriate use of planning tools. The fifth deadly sin. Planning processes failed to develop true strategic choices. Planners and executives rushed to adopt the first strategy that satisfied, meaning met, certain basic conditions in an acceptable manner. They made no real effort to search for or analyze an array of strategy alternatives before making a decision. As a result, companies all too often adopted strategies by default rather than by choice. The sixth deadly sin. Planning neglected the organizational and cultural requirements of strategy. The process focused rightly on the external environment, but it did so at the expense of the internal environment that is critical in the implementation stage. And the deadly sins, number 7, single point forecasting was an inappropriate basis for planning and an error of restructuring and uncertainty. Companies still tended to rely on single point forecasting. Scenario-based planning was the exception rather than the rule. Plans that relied on single point forecasting suffered increased vulnerability to surprises. Moreover, because planning assumptions spelled out a single future, one that was almost always some slight variation of an extrapolation of past trends, there was an inherent bias in favor of continuing a momentum strategy. And the next box is forecasting hoops. Atomic energy might be as good as our present-day explosives, but it's unlikely to produce anything more dangerous. Ooh, there was Winston Churchill. I think there's a world market for about 5 computers. Watson, president of IBM. X-rays are a hoax. Lord Kelvin. Not within 1,000 years will man ever fly. Wilbur Wright. Item in a South African newspaper. A weather forecast should be obtained before leaving, as weather conditions are extremely unpredictable. Researcher in a British Foreign Office from 1903 to 1950. Year after year, the worriers and fretters would come to me with awful predictions of the outbreak of war. I denied it each time. I was only wrong twice. Okay, let's see what the next box is. The soft underbelly of hard data. Let me get a drink of something. soft underbelly of hard data. The belief that strategic managers and their planning systems can be detached from the subject of their efforts is predicated on one fundamental assumption, that they can be informed in a formal way. The messy world of random noise, gossip, interference, impression, and fact must be reduced to firm data, hardened and aggregated so that they can be supplied regularly in digestible form. In other words, systems must do it, whether they go by the name of information technology, strategic information systems, expert systems, total systems, or just plain so-called management information systems. Unfortunately, the hard data on which such systems depend often proves to have a decidedly soft underbelly. Number 1, hard information is often limited in scope, lacking richness and often failing to encompass important non-economic and quantitative forces. Much information important for strategy making never does become hard fact. The expression on a customer's face, the mood in the factory, the tone of voice of a government official, all of this can be information for the manager, but not the formal system. That's why managers generally spend a great deal of time developing their own personal information systems comprising networks, contacts, and informers of all kinds. Number 2. Hard information is too aggregated for effective use in strategy making. The obvious solution for a manager overloaded with information and pressed for time necessary to process it is to have the information aggregated. General Electric, before 1980, provided an excellent example of this type of thinking. First, it introduced strategic business units over the divisions and departments, then sectors over strategic business units, each time seeking to increase the level of aggregation to enable top management to comprehend the necessary information quickly. The problem is that a great deal is lost in such aggregating, often the essence of the information itself. How much could aggregated data on 6 sectors really tell the GE chief executives about the complex organization they headed? It's fine to see forest, but only so long as nothing is going on among the trees. Richard Neustadt commented, "It's not information of a general sort that helps a president see personal stakes, not summaries, not surveys, not bland amalgams. Rather, it's the odds and ends of tangible detail that piece together in his mind and illuminate the underside of issues put before him. He must become his own director of central intelligence. Number 3. Much hard information arrives too late to be of use in strategy making. Information takes time to harden. Time is required for trends and events and performance to appear as facts. More time for these facts to be aggregated into reports. Even more time if these reports have to be presented on a predetermined schedule. But strategy making has to be an active, dynamic process, often unfolding quickly in reaction to immediate stimuli. Managers cannot wait for information to harden while competitors are running off with valued customers. And number 4, finally, a surprising amount of hard information is unreliable. Soft information is supposed to be unreliable, subject to all kinds of biases. Hard information, in contrast, is supposed to be concrete and precise. It is, after all, transmitted and stored electronically. In fact, hard information can be far worse than soft information. Something is always lost in the process of quantification before those electrons are activated. Anyone who has ever produced a quantitative measure, whether a reject count in a factory or a publication count in a university, knows just how much distortion is possible, intentional as well as unintentional. Devens described in his fascinating account of planning for British aircraft production in World War II, despite the arbitrary assumptions made in the collection of some data, once a figure was put forward, it soon became accepted as the agreed figure, since no one was able by rational argument to demonstrate that it was wrong. And once the figures were called statistics, they acquired the authority and sanctity of the Holy Writ. Of course, soft information can be speculative and distorted too, but what marketing manager faced with a choice between today's rumor that a major customer has seen lunching with a competitor and tomorrow's fact the business was lost would hesitate to act on the former? Moreover, a single story from one disgruntled customer may be worth more than all those reams of market research data simply because while the latter may identify a problem, it's the former that can suggest the solution. Overall, in our opinion, while hard data may inform the intellect, it is largely soft data that builds wisdom. Okay, next box is capital budgeting versus strategy formation. Capital budgeting is an established procedure by which unit managers, division heads, functional managers, etc., propose individual products up the hierarchy for approval. These are supposed to be assessed in terms of their cost benefits, combined in business to indicate return on investment, so that the senior managers can compare and rank them and accept only as many as the capital funding available for a given period allows. Because of the impetus of flow from unit managers to general managers, capital budgeting is sometimes referred to as bottom-up strategic planning. Evidence on the actual practice of capital budgeting tells a very different story. One of the early studies in an intensive probe into the process in one large divisionalized firm found that the senior management had a propensity to approve all the products that reached its level. The important question, wrote the author, was whether that group of officers which possessed the power to move proposals through the funding process chose to identify a particular proposal for sponsorship, because once that happened, proposals had more or less free passage. In a later study, Marsh et al. Looked carefully at 3 firms considered sophisticated in their use of capital budgeting and found all kinds of problems. The procedure manuals proved quite hard to locate. The presentation to the divisional board in one firm was described as a con job and another as rubber stamping. Hard to qualify cost and benefits were excluded from the financial analysis. Brahms and Gomberg found evidence of capital projects in some Finnish and Swedish firms regularly missing the mark, requiring 25% return on investment while consistently getting around 7%. These authors referred to this self-deception, these mantras, as socially accepted fact. Capital budgeting, therefore, appears to be a formal means, not to plan strategy, but to structure the consideration of projects and to inform senior management about them. For example, most capital budgeting seems to take place in the context of existing strategies, which means in the absence of any fresh strategy thinking. In other words, it reinforces the strategies already being pursued. Of course, some capital projects may break established patterns and thereby create precedents that change strategy in emergent fashion. But we suspect that capital budgeting itself may actually work to impede such strategic change and to discourage strategic thinking. Capital budgeting is a disjointed process, or more to the point, a disjointing one. Projects are expected to be proposed independently along departmental or divisional lines. Any joint effects across units have to be ignored for the convenience of formal analysis. But since synergy is the essence of creative strategy, the realization of new advantageous combinations, then capital budgeting may discourage it. If the key players had acted on the rational financial information available at the time, there would have been no xerography, no aircraft, no jet engines, no television, no computers, and so on ad infinitum. Picture yourself as a senior manager reviewing capital proposals on the basis of financial projections. How are you to think strategically when everything comes to you split in bits and pieces, in concise, numerical, disconnected terms? Now picture yourself as a project sponsor sitting behind your computer. You're not being asked to conceive strategies, not even to think about the future of your unit. All they want from you is quantitative justification for the moves you wish to make, each one separated in a nice, neat little package for the convenient comprehension of your superiors, delivered on their schedule. To conclude, taken seriously, we find that not only is capital budgeting not strategy formation, it's most decidedly impedes strategy formation, but taken by its effects, it can sometimes have an inadvertent influence on the strategies that organizations do pursue, in contradiction to the dictates of its own model. In the last box, the upside of toolism. Number 1, every tool carries a set of strengths and weaknesses. Success requires understanding the full effects and side effects of each tool, then creatively combining the right ones in the right ways at the right time. The secret is in learning which tool to use, how, and when. Tools should be judged by their utility, not their novelty. That was number 2. Number 3, tools exist for the benefit of people, not vice versa. Management tools are credited by their advocates with saving corporations almost as loudly as they are blamed by their critics for destroying them. The truth is, tools do neither. People make companies succeed or fail. And that is the end of chapter 3.